The morning had started like dozens before it. Low fog across the pasture, fence wire beading silver, the steady hush of milk in the pail. Eli Cartwright worked by habit and feel, the way his father had and his grandfather before him, hands sure on the udder, cheek against the warm rib of the jersey, steam lifting off the pail in the chill. Out beyond the barn, Paradise Valley lay like a shallow bowl cupping light. Cottonwoods stitched the Yellowstone River in a pale line, and the lower shoulders of the Absarokas kept the sky propped open. When the last cow was stripped and the pail carried to the porch, he rinsed his hands under the pump, shook water from his sleeves, and stood a long moment listening to the soft knocking of a loose gate in the breeze. Today's list could have been any day's. Check the stock tank float, pull thistle by the south fence, grease the auger bearings, see if the sorrel needed a new shoe. But he let the list fall back for later. 20 quiet minutes in the timber above Emigrant were their own kind of work, the sort that kept him right enough to do all the others. He grabbed his old jacket, the waxed canvas one that smelled like liniment and rain, and the cap with the sweat-stained brim, then stepped through the last barbed wire opening and onto the game path that edged up behind his place. The Cartwright place sat a ways north of the speck of town that was Emigrant, Montana. One gas station, one post office window, a bar with a neon trout, and a diner that scrambled eggs honest and strong. The timberline above his pastures rose toward Redgate Ridge, a notch locals used to judge incoming weather. Elk took that route in October, and black bear nosed through snowberries in late August. Now in early June, the brush was all leaf, and the ground kept the nights chill. Eli wasn't much for talking, even to himself, but he had a way of measuring out the country with footsteps. Past the notch of 2 lightning-blasted pines, over the slab of granite, with the shallow cup worn from some old seep, through a braid of young fir where jays always scolded, across the narrower of 2 gullies, the second one banked with ferns. He let the valley thoughts, feed bills, the neighbor's busted water line, whether the east pasture had enough grass to support keeping heifers on it an extra week, drift off like the last of the fog. His lungs filled with resin and damp leaf, and the little ache in his lower back that always followed the first cutting began to soften. It came into him first as a contradiction, the way odd things do when you know a piece of country as well as your own kitchen. Not a colour so much as a curve that didn't belong. Metal, dulled down to a world-weary yellow, peeking through 9 different greens. He slowed and squinted, palm up to push aside older shoots, the tiny hairs on his forearms stirring with a feeling he didn't have a name for, but trusted. The forest held 70 years of ruins if you knew how to see them, broken cross braces where a hay derrick once stood, a scatter of square nails where a shack had gone back to dirt. But this curve sat higher, broader, stubborn, as a buried boulder in a harrowed field. He stepped through salmonberry, got slapped by a wet branch that beaded his cheek with cold, and looked up into it. A bus. An old-school bus with its nose turned a little downhill, sunken to its hubs and veined with vine. The paint, what the paint had been, hunkered under rust and moss, but the impulse of yellow hung on, the way certain mornings keep the taste of winter even when it's June. Windows clouded or spidered, one of the roof ribs bowed under a blanket of leaves. The forest had made itself at home inside, the same way it did with deadfall, slow and patient, and without apology. He put his hand to the fender, surprised by the cold tucked under shade. No road noise up here, just a single drip off the stovepipe of some unseen snag, a squirrel scratching bark, the thin metallic tick his mind supplied from a lifetime of engines cooling. On the side, through freckles of rust, he could still read a ghost of a stripe where letters had been. He imagined the letters, district or county or maybe just school, without quite wanting to, then took his hand away and looked at the door. The door was ajar by the width of a finger and more grown shut by moss than hinge. He pressed his shoulder into it, and the bus exhaled a sound so tired it felt alive. The rubber lip along the edge stuck and let go with a long, complaining kiss. Dust lifted, turned to silk in the narrow shafts of light that sneaked through fractures of glass. He pulled his cap off without deciding to, and held it in his hand because the place felt like a room, not a machine. It wasn't a bus inside anymore. Someone had wrestled a life into it. Two narrow beds ran along the walls, slatted from scavenged boards and topped with what had once been foam pads wrapped in blanket remnants. A table wedged against the window's frame had a wobble cured with a folded magazine whose cover had gone to grey. Shelves made from fruit crates held a line of tins with labels ghosted by time. Peaches, almost legible on one, tomato on another. A small iron stove squatted up front, its stovepipe patched where it passed through the roof, with a ring of flattened tin flashing that had been cut with a snips and nailed, as careful as any roofer could have managed with better tools. He could smell ash under the damp, an old sweet that meant heat had once lived here. He was a man raised to keep his hands off other folks' things, even if those folks were gone to wherever folks go. But respect has its own way of looking. On a panel above the table, he found colour. A sun spoke like a wagon wheel. A square house with a triangle roof and a crooked door. 3 stick figures holding hands. Crayon, wax dulled to a chalky persistence that had held on through steam and season. He didn't touch at first, then he did with one knuckle, light as if he were testing whether paint on a barn had dried. By the back bed, pencil notches with dates climbed in a column. March, June, October. Different years, some numbers when the hand was sure, some when it shook. Heights that rose by inches until one year stuttered longer than the others. He read them under his breath, the way he read ear tags or grain weights or the measurements scrawled on his own barn wall where he'd marked a bull's withers 20 years back. He saw the toy after, and he wasn't sure if seeing it or smelling ash had done more to press the air out of him. A little wooden car on a shelf, the kind you make when you've got more knife than money, painted once in a colour that had lost its name. He took it in his palm. It had heft. Some kid had driven it along those shelves and the lip of that table and the edge of that windowsill, and then set it where it sat now to go do something else. And time had come in and finished the setting. He crouched to study the floor. Most of the planks had accepted their new life as part of a damp thing, edges swollen, grain raised, nail heads brown and soft. A patch in the middle was wrong. Newer cuts, less swelling, seated too clean. He tapped with his knuckle. Hollow came back. "All right," he said to the bus, and his voice sounded like a stranger's. He worried 2 fingers into the seam, felt the stubbornness of wood that didn't want to let go, and eased the board up. Dust feathered his sleeve and hung there until a spear of light made it a galaxy. Between the steel ribs of the bus was a cavity lined haphazard with a burlap sack. Inside lay a canvas rucksack, the kind with metal clasps, the kind you might have taken into Livingston to buy fence staples and coffee back when folks used rucksacks for everything. He set it on the table and clicked the corroded clasp with his thumbnail. Practical came first, because practical was always the first layer of any life. Twine coiled like a nest, a pocket knife with a blade rubbed down by a stone into that shape only pocket knives get. A tin that rattled, matches by the feel. A folded map whose creases no longer aligned where they should, edges gone fur. He set each thing down with the ragged care of a man who'd learned that some breakables were invisible. Under those, letters. Envelopes yellowed to the shade of straw, edges soft, script careful and leaning right. He slid one free where the seal had already broken. The paper warmed under his fingers and threatened to split if he breathed wrong. He read. Eli was no hand at other people's words. He favoured invoices and feed ratios and the kinds of notes men make to themselves that no one else could read. But these lines came plain. The hand wrote about weather the way everyone here wrote about weather, because weather was vocational and spiritual both. It wrote about a boy's cough easing with spring, about trout still holding in the bend below the rock that looked like a cradle, about a stove drawing clean, about a sun drawn on the wall that was bright enough to keep the cold out. He read that line twice and felt the room shift a little, as if the bus had drawn breath. He slid the letter back inside its envelope and felt for more. There were photographs wrapped in a handkerchief so soft it had given up being cloth and remembered being air. He fanned the pictures across the table, the way you fan a hand of cards that matters. The edges curled, the emulsion gone matte with age, but the hearts of them held. A A man stood with a kid on his shoulders, both squinting smiles into a light that must have been the very kind falling through the bus now. Behind them, the bus hulked like proof. In another, the boy held the wooden car, the very wooden car, which made the space between then and now about the thickness of Eli's thumb. He found his own mouth smiling back before he could stop it. That modest reflex he had for new calves and old dogs, and anything that showed its trust, without knowing you'd take care. He put the photographs back in the handkerchief back under the matches and the knife and the map, the letters under that, and he slid the rucksack back into its dark shape as if he were easing a sleeping thing into bed. The board settled with a hush that told him it had always been meant to. Outside, the day had sharpened. The valley light had burned off the last of the fog and poured itself into the river until the whole thing seemed to belly with brightness. Eli put his cap on and put his palm flat to the bus's flank one more time, not because he believed in signs, but because touch is a kind of belief. He stood there a few breaths longer than he meant to. Then he took the path back down, his boots finding the same soft places they'd found coming up, but each step landing with the weight of a second life riding his own. He stopped at the Pinecone Diner, because a man does what he always does unless a reason bigger than habit tells him otherwise, and coffee was reason enough to sit. The bell over the door had been rung by the same breeze for 30 years. Harlan Pike stood behind the counter, the way Harlan had stood behind every counter he'd ever owned. Hips cocked against a shelf, towel across his shoulder, like a flag of truce between him and everything that might spill. "You look like you went up past Red Gate," Harlan said, pouring without asking. "I went up," Eli said. He hadn't meant to say anything more than that, but something in Harlan's eyes, curiosity gentled into respect by time and work, made him add, "Saw an old bus in there. School bus." Harlan's face did a little thing in the middle, a crease that made him look exactly like his father had the day the arcade burned down. He set the pot back on the burner and leaned both palms on the counter. "Well," he said, the word the size of a porch. "You found it." "What is it I found?" Eli asked, though he knew the answer in the way you know when a storm over Livingston is going to come down your end of the valley despite polite wishes. Harlan looked toward the window where the Absarokas showed a shoulder above grain elevators, then back at Eli. He kept his voice down, not because anyone else in the diner cared, but because certain stories asked for a smaller voice. "My dad called it the Bell Place. Folks say the man's name was Jonah Bell. Some say he taught down in Gardiner before. Others say he worked the mill on Mill Creek, when there was still something worth milling. What most everyone agrees on is he lost his wife. Illness, maybe. Winter took the rest. He had a little boy, came up into those trees with what he could haul, and made that bus warm." Harlan wiped an invisible circle off the counter, a habit he had when he didn't want his hands to be without work. People saw him sometimes on the road into Emigrant, later at the little store up toward Prey. Didn't take charity, didn't sell pride, traded fair. The boy was the quiet kind that held on to the hem of your coat with 2 fingers and watched everything like it had a reason. They say Jonah cut and stacked more wood than a horse could pull if the horse didn't believe in winter, and he packed water from the creek and kept the bus set right against the wind like he'd been born to place buildings where weather wouldn't find them. Harlan breathed out through his nose. That was a lot of years back. Some say the boy got sick late one season when the cold hung on and the creek kept speaking ice. Some say they left together when the first bluebirds came, slid down the old logging road on a day soft as a calf's nose. Some say they found Jonah just a piece from the bus come spring. You can pick the ending you can live with. We didn't tell it much when tourists came through. Some places up here work better as mysteries than attractions. Eli nodded. The coffee had gone cold in his cup, and he didn't mind. The diner felt like the bus for a moment, a room that held more than its volume. He left cash under the mug, touched the brim of his cap in Harlan's direction, and stepped back into the honest glare of noon. He didn't go back up that day. He went home and cut thistle by the south fence, and greased the auger bearings, and set the float in the stock tank right. And lost the better part of an hour trying to find where the sorrel was favoring his right front, because the shoe was on tight enough, and there was no abscess he could feel. He ate standing up at the sink, the way he always did, on days he didn't have the appetite to sit. 2 slices of bread, a slab of last night's roast, a tomato cut with a pocket knife. He worked until the shadow of Red Gate stretched long enough to make the valley into a single cooled thing, and the swallows began their low loops over the corrals. In the barn, under the old steel rafters, his father had welded by a man named Smitty, who drank himself to death the winterbrack. Eli turned 16. He stood with a stub of chalk and looked at a beam. The beam had a history on it, names and dates and stupid little drawings from a dozen nephews and nieces, and one woman he almost married. He drew a line, notched a date, and didn't write a name beside it, because the name that belonged might never be brought out loud in that place. He stood with his palm on the beam. A breeze slipped through the gap above the hayloft door and made the dust look like a thing you could drink. He slept the way men do when they respect their fatigue, flat and heavy, waking once to remember a line in a letter he hadn't written, and another time to stand at the window and listen to coyotes braid their thin singing somewhere between his fence and the river. At first light he was up because the work he'd let be patient the day before had shifted toward urgent. The second cutting would come sooner than he wanted, and the pump out by the lower well had an opinion about rust that needed persuading. He walked the east pasture and mentally bargained with grass. He set a post where a drift had shoved a section out. He put a boot in the belly of a balky feeder, and it thought better. At noon, he went inside and made coffee, and stood with the cup cooling under his hand without drinking, full from the morning in a way food wouldn't change. By mid-afternoon, the bus had pulled him back the way certain songs do after a funeral. He took a small roll of plastic and a length of cord, because weather is weather, and kindness is easy if you keep it on a shelf by the door. He climbed slower, more watchful not of bears or elk, but of his own curiosity, which could have you setting a bad boot on a worse stone if you didn't put a bridle on it. The bus didn't look different, because the forest had no interest in whether he had a new story about it. But the air around it felt more like a room he'd paid for. He stood a moment and listened. Wind laddering leaves up high, a flicker chipping bark, the far-off burr of a diesel on 89 that the valley threw up in the right pockets like gossip. He opened the door with less protest from the hinge and stepped in with the cap already in his hand. He fixed the little places you fix when you have the plastic and the cord. Tied a flap of fabric to cover the worst of an open pane so rain wouldn't come in sideways on a certain wind. Tucked the edge of the curtain so the sun wouldn't eat the colour of the only picture in the room that had a shot at keeping its colour. He wiped the table down with his sleeve, because dust suggests neglect, and neglect was not what this place had been built from. He didn't open the floor. He didn't need to. He touched the pencil marks again, read the dates and heights, and let the rise of them climb into him. On the way down, he cut a switch of willow and carried it like a walking stick he'd forgotten to have in his hand the rest of his life. When the trees thinned and the river threw its light into his eyes like a dare, he stopped and looked back up at that pocket of timber that now held something inside it with his fingerprints on it. He wasn't a man given to vows or prayers. He made the kind of promise a rancher knows he can keep. He would not speak of the place to those who'd go up to take. He would speak of it to those who'd go up to leave it intact. He would carry it, which is lighter than wood and heavier than most anything. People have a way of hearing about things anyway, even in a valley where news moves slow unless it shouts. 2 weeks later, his nearest neighbor, Wade Morrison, who had a talent for finding arrowheads and trouble, rolled up in an old Ford and leaned on his horn long enough to make Eli cross the yard with his jaw set. "You hear about the school bus up behind you?" Wade said, as if he were telling Eli where his own creek ran in spring. "I heard things," Eli said. "Fellas from Livingston came up and said they'll haul it off. Scrap. Easy money." Wade said easy the way men say fool's gold. Eli studied the dust on Wade's hood and saw, clear as the river on a cold January, a chain hooked to the bus's bones. A dragline cut where there had been only deer hooves and care. The quiet thing turned loud for a few dollars and a story told at the mint that didn't belong to the teller. He wiped his hand along his jaw. "You send him up my way?" "I sent him toward the wrong ridge," Wade said, mouth doing something that almost became a smile. "Figured you'd have an opinion." "I do," Eli said. He had more than one. He kept them all together where they'd be useful. That night he drove into Emigrant and sat at the bar with the neon trout and asked Harlan who in Livingston was paying for scrap the way a man asks what wheat is going for, open and uninterested in pretense. Harlan wrote a name on a napkin because writing is sometimes a favor to memory. Eli folded the napkin into his wallet and drove home with the windows cracked enough to make the truck smell like hay and river. He didn't drive to Livingston. He didn't need to. He told 3 men who moved heavy things for a living, men with forearms like fence posts and wives with better sense, to keep their ears to the ground. He told the game warden, a kid from up on the High Line, whose father had taken him duck hunting at 7, and grief-stricken and gentle since the winter he'd had, to put down a wounded bull. The kid nodded in a way that meant he'd put his truck where it needed to be if trucks started showing up where they didn't belong. Summer turned its wheel. The second cutting came and went, hot and short, the kind of July that made your tongue feel made of flour. The river fell back, and the stones showed their white backs. Fires bloomed a state away and sent their exhausted breath north to sit on the valley like a lid. Eli kept the bus in his mind like a letter he hadn't finished reading. On days when the smoke made the world small, he went up and set another square of plastic where a branch had jabbed the last one and watched the ash fall through the broken light like a snow that wouldn't bless anything. He read the dates on the wall out loud once in a voice smaller than the trees, and felt that do him good in a way he wouldn't have trusted from anything else. Come September, when the nights started to smell like iron again and the calves' hides grew longer without their permission, he walked up with a thermos and sat in the doorway of the bus and drank coffee that cooled too fast. He said the names he'd given the people in the pictures because Harlan had given him one, Jonah, and others showed up if you spoke the first. He didn't say them loud, just enough to weight the air the way a nail will make a string hang straight. He told the bus about his father because the bus knew how to hold a story and keep its mouth shut, and he told it about the woman he almost married and didn't because the valley asked different kinds of devotion from different kinds of folks, and he didn't have room for both. He laughed once in that doorway, quietly, because the laugh felt like it belonged the way a stove did. Snow came the way it always did. One cheap taunt of a storm that left the ground green and cocky. Then the real thing that stacked itself carefully against fence posts and tucked itself under the lips of rocks. He went up after the first good lay and saw where elk had written their cursive across his lower pasture, where fox had stitched along the ditch, where a single set of tracks, a man's maybe, had come to within 50 yards of where the path cut toward the bus and then turned. He followed his own boots instead, stepped careful on the slick boards of the doorframe, and looked around a room that had learned 100 winters already. The plastic he'd tied kept more than it didn't. The stove had a patina of cold ash that looked like a memory of heat. He stood there until his feet told him it was time to go find warmth that would keep a living man. The kid warden stopped by in March when the world was all thaw and threat. He leaned on his truck door and told Eli about 2 Livingston boys who'd driven a chain as far as a locked gate, had a talk with a rancher who'd been taught politeness bluntly, and decided scrap had lost some of its shine. Eli nodded and offered coffee and meant it, and the kid took it because he knew there are some things you say yes to. In May, a year to the day after the first time he put his hand on the bus's fender, Eli woke to fog again and milked through it. The pasture beaded silver like the first sentence of a thing he'd once read and wanted to keep. He rinsed his hands and stood listening to the pump knock, and then the quiet after. He walked up without meaning to, his boots finding the same old soft places that had known him now as one more creature on a path. The bus took him in, with the same indifference and mercy it had offered from the start. He set his cap on the table the way you do when you come home tired and don't want to crease anything more than you have to. A flicker of colour he hadn't caught before showed itself under the edge of a shelf. Not new, just new to his particular eyes on that particular day. He crouched and found a drawing folded small, the paper brittle, the crayon still stubborn. Another sun, another square house, 2 stick figures this time. The 3 replaced by 2, in a way that made his throat feel too tight for the room's air. He put it back where it had been, tucked it better from the light, and let the bus keep doing its work, which was to hold what it held without asking for anything it hadn't been given. On his way down, he stopped at the diner and sat at the counter while Harlan wiped the same invisible circle. They didn't talk about the bus. They didn't need to. They talked about the river's flow rate and whether the hoppers would be heavy enough to bring in people with rods and opinions. And they talked about the kid who wanted to sell the old Jensen place because he'd inherited it and had mail he wanted more than land. And they talked about how a certain kind of quiet is not the absence of sound, but the presence of the right ones. Eli left Cash and walked out into light that made the gravel 1,000 little mirrors. That night he took the chalk again to the beam and drew a line a finger's width above the one from last year. He dated it and didn't write a name. He stood with his forehead against the cool wood, barn smells filling the spaces. Grief leaves when it loosens its grip enough to let work in. He thought of a line he had read about a crayon sun bright enough to keep the cold out, and he figured some suns keep their work done long after the hands that drew them have gone on to whatever country keeps what we've made that was worth the making. He slept, and he woke, and the valley kept doing what valleys do when they're loved by people who can keep their end of the bargain. Some days the path up behind his place called him like a bell, and some days it waited without offense. He told 3 people he trusted where the bus was and told them why he trusted them, and those 3 told 2 more the same way, and the thing stayed whole because good rumor can be a fence if it runs the right direction. Once in a while a stranger came into the diner and said something about a haunted bus, and Harlan would wipe the counter and say he didn't know what all people call haunted these days, and pour coffee. Eli grew a little older in the way men notice. Boots wearing different, a knee that knew rain an hour before the sky did, a tenderness for small chores he used to curse. On winter afternoons, when the wind ran out of the canyon like it had business with everyone in the valley, he stood at his window and could just make out the line of timber that held the bus, and he lifted his cup a fraction in that direction, like a neighbor you don't wave to, because that would be foolishness, but you nod for the sake of manners. He bought a pack of crayons at the store one day without thinking, and then laughed at himself in the truck. Loud enough that the dog in the back lifted his head and looked affronted. He carried the pack up and set it on the table and walked away, and didn't think about whether anyone would ever use them. It was enough that they were there, a small absurdity in a room that had long ago made a habit of taking absurdities and shaping them into necessity. He never took anything out of the bus, except the dust off the table he wiped with his sleeve and his own breath, which he left and took back and left again. He never put anything in besides the piece of plastic and the cord and that box of crayons, and once, the smallest note a man can leave, a folded scrap that read, "I saw you." He tucked it under the edge of the curtain and walked down with the feeling a man gets after he's set a post plumb in a hole that was nothing but rock and stubbornness before the first shovel went in. If any ending has to be chosen from the old ways folks told it, he chose the one that let him sleep, but it didn't matter much. The truth of the thing had settled into him, where truth goes when it's useful. Not as a fact to win an argument, but as a weight that keeps you from lifting in winds you ought to bow to. He had found a room in the timber where love had been hardened into habit and heat, where sorrow had been given a shape that could be carried by 2 human hands, where a child's heights had been marked, not as a record to brag on, but as a ritual that says we are still here. He carried that room. He tended fences, and he watched weather, and he fed animals that trusted him to know the difference between need and want. and he let that carrying make him, bit by unremarkable bit, into the kind of neighbor a place like Emigrant, Montana, counts as luck. One spring, toward evening, when the river took on the color of new penny, and the swallows drew letters in the air no one living could read, he drove past the turn to the timber and kept going, because sometimes the best way to keep something is to give it one more day without you. He crossed the Yellowstone at the Emigrant Bridge and looked down at water shouldering its way around rocks that had been set there before any of the names people put on things. He thought of Jonah without trying to, and of the boy, and of a woman whose name he didn't have and wouldn't dare guess. He thought of the crayon sun and the penciled marks and the little wooden car. He turned the truck back toward the valley and home, and the small, honest fatigue waiting there like a quilt turned down. In bed, in the thin place between waking and whatever comes, he said thank you into the dark with no address on it. The morning came around again like it always did. Fog low, fence wire silver, milk whispering into a pail, and he went to his work, softened by a story that would never finish telling itself and would never need to.